As far as I can see, he knew what he was wanting to do, knew what he was doing, and he went and did it. There's no justification. If he comes out again, he'll still be a danger in society.
You've shown no remorse or apologised for her death.
Killer narcissists.
He was the last person to see her after they had an argument at their family home.
We had a bit of an argument in regards to the store figures.
He kept tripping up because he thought he was invincible.
Expert abusers.
Very deliberate manipulation to make her think that she's nuts.
The same strategies.
He used to call her princess.
The same traits.
A grandiosity, an entitlement, a lack of empathy.
And it's never their fault.
Mental illness called her death, not me.
As incidents rise,
more women are being murdered by their partners than ever before.
Yeah, you disposed of her in an undignified way.
And sentences don't.
Women as victims have such low status, even when they lose their lives.
They are dangerous and they will remain dangerous.
We investigate why,
dumping her over a ledge to leave her lying in mud,
these criminals continue.
Boris, did you kill Karen?
To be underestimated.
I've got nothing to say to you.
Introducing Kiss and Kill. Episode 5. Anthony Eriksen.
Lisa Fenwick, 59, a marketer, editor, writer, and now a statistic. Killed overnight, Easter, stabbed multiple times in the chest. Her accused murderer, none other than her partner of 13 years, Tony Eriksen.
I'm Alison Sandy. I was tempted to start this episode with the line, an all too familiar story, but that's become an all too familiar opening.
Good evening. A fugitive accused of carrying out a deadly shooting rampage in the state's Central West remains on the run tonight.
At least every week, another woman is murdered in Australia.
It's been more than 24 hours since Julian Ingram allegedly murdered his pregnant ex-girlfriend and 2 others in the town of Lake Cargelligo.
And sometimes that's just the start.
Police and paramedics did what they could, but Sophie, John and the unborn baby died by the side of the road.
Unlike this horrible tragedy, the death of Lisa Fenwick in April 2023 was one of those cases that almost slipped by unnoticed.
A beautiful, sweet lady, gentle, softly spoken, interesting and funny.
Partly because there weren't other victims. No one noticed just how much danger she was in. And there was no doubt as to what happened.
Just the wrong combination of people.
Eriksen was a far cry from the ticking time bomb Thompson appeared to be, yet he exploded in a fit of homicidal rage in exactly the same way.
Facing court in Parramatta, Eriksen appeared emotionless as the magistrate read out his murder charge. If convicted, he faces the prospect of life in prison.
And according to court records, had no care or concern for the victim or what he did to her. This is how it happened.
In the morning, the footage showed the offender leaving at 10:54 a.m. to walk Miss Fenwick's 2 dogs.
Justice Andrew Coleman presided over the case. We were granted access to use the court audio.
The offender was shown returning to the unit at 11:09 a.m. The offender did not leave the unit again until police arrived later that night. At 3:31 p.m, the offender received a text message from Miss Fenwick with a link to flatmates.com.au. Under a minute later, at 3:32 p.m, Miss Fenwick sent a message to him stating, "Not sure if they will want a 60-year-old man though." I infer the link sent by Miss Fenwick was for a place at another unit on that website that the offender could move to, with the second message casting doubt on whether the offender would be considered suitable because of his age. The CCTV footage also depicted Miss Fenwick leaving the unit and the unit complex to take the dogs for a walk at 5:17 p.m. She returned to the unit at 5:24 p.m. She appeared to be intoxicated. From the time Miss Fenwick returned to the unit, each of Miss Fenwick and the offender were inside the unit. At 6:04 p.m, the offender called 000. He said there was an emergency at the unit address. The recording of the 000 call has the operator asking the offender what happened. He said, we got into an argument. When asked again what happened, he told the operator, well, I put a knife into her. The police and ambulance responded, and at 6:16 p.m, the first police and paramedics had arrived at the unit complex. After some difficulty in getting access to the floor on which the unit was located, as ambulance officers approached the unit, the offender came out into the hallway in a robe talking on his mobile phone to the 000 operator. Miss Fenwick was found lying on the bedroom floor with multiple stab wounds. She was not breathing, had no pulse, and was pronounced dead at 6:25 p.m. Police arrived and saw a silver knife in the kitchen sink with blood on the blade that appeared slightly watery. The offender was arrested, cautioned and handcuffed in the hallway outside the unit. Police observed a small amount of blood on his face, right hand and foot, which were photographed.
No longer groomed and clean-shaven, Eriksen appeared thin and bedraggled with medium-length silver hair, donning a bright green prison jumpsuit. He represented himself at the trial, pleading not guilty, saying he didn't mean to and was suffering from sane automatism by dissociation or sleepwalking. Eriksen admitted to stabbing Lisa, but denied it was a voluntary or willful act. He also denied he intended to kill her or cause grievous bodily harm, and wouldn't agree to any kind of psychological assessment. This was the closest they got. The report from the risk intervention team, which was tendered in court.
On 10 April 2023, a registered nurse, Polly, performed a welfare check given it was Mr Eriksen's first time in custody and the high-profile nature of his charges. She noted that he appeared to be in a good mood and easy, responsive engagement. Mr Eriksen was placed on a risk intervention team RIT protocol, which is used when patients are at risk of self-harm as a precautionary measure. He was assessed by the RIT team on 11 April 2023, who noted that he was tearful at times but engaged well and did not appear overly agitated or distressed. He denied any history of mental health diagnoses or treatment, and the team did not identify any features of mental illness. During RIT review on 13 April 2023, Mr Eriksen reported he felt much better and found the time alone in a safe cell to be beneficial as it gave me time to think. Mr Eriksen said he was eager to share a cell to have someone to talk to. There were no signs of mental illness identified by the team on that review. On the final RIT review on 14 April 2023, he was noted to be bright in mood, jovial and reactive. He was discharged from a RIT into normal cell placement. Mr Eriksen was reviewed by the mental health nurse on 17 April 2023 as a routine measure due to the nature of his charges. He denied any mental health history or current concerns. On mental state assessment, he was noted to be jovial and reactive with no psychotic features. Mr Eriksen was seen by a social worker, Emily Harris, on 19 April 2023. This was at the patient's own request. He complained about feeling isolated. Of note, he stated he was struggling. Mr Eriksen also commented on not dwelling on the past. Ms Harris noted that Mr Eriksen appeared very calm and that she has concerns about his relaxed appearance given the nature of his charges, first time in custody and lack of social supports.
Due to overwhelming evidence, there was never any doubt of the verdict.
Miss Fenwick was stabbed in the bedroom. This was where Miss Fenwick's body was found, surrounded by blood, and there was no other significant blood deposits or blood trails in other parts of the unit, indicating that she had been stabbed elsewhere and had moved to the bedroom. Miss Fenwick suffered at least 18 stab wounds to her torso. 11 of those penetrated her chest and abdominal cavities. Miss Fenwick suffered 6 sharp force injuries to her right arm and 2 to her right thigh. These sharp force injuries were caused by the offender stabbing her with a kitchen knife, and I infer those to her arm were caused while she was trying to protect herself. The knife that was used by the offender was the knife found in the sink when the police arrived. The cause of death was the injuries to Miss Fenwick's torso caused by the multiple sharp force injuries resulting from her being stabbed multiple times by the offender. Miss Fenwick was unarmed during the stabbing. The offender had a small cut to the inside of his left index finger, but was otherwise uninjured during the incident. The number of wounds indicates a repeated and frenzied attack by the offender on Miss Fenwick. This was not just a momentary loss of control or a fit of temper. The offender kept up the attack, stabbing Miss Fenwick multiple times in her upper body. I am satisfied, beyond reasonable doubt, that the offender did intend to kill Miss Fenwick at the time he stabbed her.
A man accused of stabbing his long-term partner to death at their unit in Sydney South has been found guilty of murder. Anthony Eriksen was representing himself in court when the jury made the unanimous decision.
A murder conviction was never the issue. It was the sentence everyone was sweating on, and that wouldn't happen for another 2.5 years. Again, like Thompson, Eriksen stabbed his partner dozens of times, admitted he did it, and showed more concern for himself than his victim. You'll recall Thompson said,
"I'm bleeding out everywhere. Man, can you please help my blood pressure? Officer, can you help my blood pressure, please?"
In Eriksen's case,
the police spoke to him and recorded the conversation on body-worn video. The offender was asked what happened. He said, it was just a huge argument. The offender was then recorded as saying, "It's just like living life is so stressful. I haven't had a job for 5 years and she just criticises me all the time and I want to have a job, but I don't have a job." When talking to another police officer, the offender said, "Oh, life." When asked what he meant by that, the offender said, "It's stressful. That's it. It's just I'm trying to get a job. That's life. Guess I'm going to jail now." Later, at the police station, he asked police officers about the condition of Miss Fenwick. When told that she had died, he said, "There has been issues for the past 7 to 9 months.
Eriksen managed to continually, haphazardly stall proceedings.
A killer who stabbed his girlfriend more than 25 times in her Mascot apartment has sacked his defence team ahead of sentencing.
Anthony Eriksen refused to respond to claims that his deadly attack on Lisa Fenwick was premeditated. Prosecutors are calling for the maximum punishment.
At the sentence hearing, Eriksen, now 64, appeared resigned to his fate, keeping his eyes downcast unless being addressed. It had now been 3 years since he murdered Lisa Fenwick.
The offender had been unemployed for a number of years and was being supported financially by Miss Fenwick. The relationship had been deteriorating for some time.
There was very little background on Eriksen at any stage of the court proceedings, and it was the same with anyone we found who encountered him.
Not necessarily friendly, keeps to himself, just walks the dogs.
Or spoke to him regularly.
I lived on level 3 and they lived on level 10, I think it was. So initially it was sort of one of those, you just see them in the elevator and, you have a couple of seconds here and there. And over the years, the friendship kind of grew. We'd see them out on the street. Tony was sort of more the stay-at-home guy, and we used to call him the mayor because he was just always out chatting to people, and so was I. So we sort of collided, and then we got to know Lisa.
Jeremy Maspero had but a very superficial glimpse into their lives, seeming as close to Eriksen as anyone was, except Lisa.
Definitely, very approachable, very outgoing, sort of happy to chat to everyone. So definitely an extrovert, and I'm kind of the same. So we just sort of struck up things from there.
Was he well groomed, well dressed? I mean, how did he appear?
The interesting thing was he always wore the same leather jacket, never changed over the years. So very well dressed, always well dressed, and that bloody leather jacket. I can't get that image out of my mind.
So what would you talk about when you caught up?
Oh, everything. Politics, what's happening on the street, what's happening overseas, everything except what was happening at home.
Yeah, and he had a lot of time on his hands by the sound of it.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, see, he didn't work. So I worked from home at the time, and it was interesting when you work from home, you get to know all the other work from homers, and then the people that don't work either. So definitely he was out and about a lot, and they had 2 schnauzers. I've forgotten their names. I call them Pistol and Boo, but those weren't the names, but always out with the dogs. So that was another reason why you'd see him a lot in the street, just walking the dogs around.
So what did he tell you he did?
It's interesting because some people, you never really discuss that. And I think not evasive, but we just never really sort of approached that topic. Yeah, he was just sort of the guy that he's like a stay-at-home, not dad, but he was just a stay-at-home guy. And we never really talked about what he did or where he came from or any of that kind of stuff.
Eventually, he and his then partner started being invited to their apartment.
I guess after probably about 1 or 2 years and, just meeting people out and about, we got to know her. She was very shy lady and very timid, but very lovely. And so once we got to know her, we'd go out with them for meals down the road because Mascot's kind of this bustling area of constantly changing sort of food and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, we started to hang out with them. I think they joined us once for Christmas at our apartment. They used to have drinks and nibbles. So we just sort of slowly got to hang out and do things like that. They were lovely people. They had a nice place. They had nice things in their apartment. And they just seemed like this kind of social couple that sort of, she was a very hard worker and he was kind of the front man.
The main reason for this was Eriksen had a lot of time on his hands. His entire lifestyle was financed by Lisa. According to his LinkedIn account, he was a self-employed food educator. Originally from Canada, but had moved to Australia in the mid-1990s. His first job was apparently Deloitte in Perth, where he remained for about 10 months. The last job is for only 2 months as a senior procurement analyst at the New South Wales Department of Finance Services and Innovation in 2017. In between those, his primary employment is funds manager at Eriksen Holdings. As for his education, there are several institutions mentioned, including Harvard, Stanford, as well as the University of British Columbia. Jeremy recalled once trying to get Eriksen a job.
I think he often used to say he was too good for everything, one of those people, I don't need to work, I'm too good for this, too good for that. So I think he didn't want to work.
Didn't you try and get him?
Yeah, so when I was living in Mascot, I was finishing my uni degree and I spent a bit of time working for a now defunct government agency. And that's right, I actually put him in touch with one of the recruiters and they did get him a contract role, quite a high ranking role. And I think he lasted about 4 hours. He turned up and walked around the place and sort of told everybody how amazing he was and how the place should change. So that didn't last very long, but again, it was kind of that added self-entitled kind of I'm too good to work type thing. So that was quite interesting, why that happened. But yeah.
What did you think at this stage? That would have been, you would have been thinking, wow, because that's not normal, right? So what were you thinking of him? Did you think he was a narcissist?
I just thought, you don't want to work. I can't remember the pay grade, but it was a very high ranking role. We're talking 6 figures and quite I can't remember exactly what the position was. It was very high up, and I just thought, wow, 4 hours you lasted or something. So I just thought, you know what, I'm not going to push that side. I just, they're kind of neighbours, friends, and I didn't really think anything more of it. But having worked in recruitment a long time ago, I just remember thinking, you've had that opportunity, and don't rely on me anymore. I mean, he wasn't relying on me, but sort of something I wouldn't do again.
What we do know is his elderly mum is in care in Canada, and his sister Christine works in real estate in Vancouver. I reached out to Christine, but she didn't respond. Fortunately, I had more luck with Lisa's mum, Leonore Fenwick, who sadly had become estranged with her daughter over the period she was involved with Eriksen.
Well, I hadn't heard from her, and she didn't answer any emails, texts. I used to send her birthday cards and Christmas cards, and include him too. And when did I know? I just knew there was something wrong, and I suspected this aspect that he was dominating her.
It worsened when Lisa's father became sick.
When my husband went into care, she rang me, and I hadn't spoken to her for 5 years, and she was very upset about me putting him into care. I think she didn't say so in so many words, but that I wasn't doing the right thing and things like that, and I responded in kind, saying, when you get your medical degree, you can tell me what to do. So after that was a while. See, he was in care for 5 years. Still no word. And I had a cleaner. I was living here, and she was an ex-policewoman. And I said, look, I'm so worried about my daughter. She could be dead because I don't know. I haven't heard from her. And where is she? I didn't even know where she lived. So she said, oh, you must certainly ask for, what is it they ask for? A welfare check. They do that, and they don't tell you anything about where she lived or anything, and they don't tell her anything about me. But so they went to her flat. I found out later he was there as well. And she told them she didn't want to be contacted. And the police rang me later and said, well, she doesn't want to be contacted. So. But I knew she was alive. This would have been about 6 months or so before she was killed. Maybe a little longer.
Like so many times when this happens, the lack of communication made it difficult to reconcile.
She did ring up my husband in care once, and of course they didn't know he had a daughter, and they said, oh, we're sorry, you're not on the contact list. And they told me later that she'd rung to speak to my husband. Why they didn't let me know, I don't know. And after that, well, that was 5 years on, that the murder occurred.
When did you learn that he killed her?
Oh, that was the night the police came to my flat here. And I was in bed, and they flashed lights in the window because I wasn't. Oh, they were banging on the windows, and then eventually they had a whistle or something, and I came up and looked out the window, and here they were. And I thought something had happened, my car was stolen or something. And I said, oh, come on up. And then they told me as they got up the stairs, we're sorry to tell you that your daughter has passed away, which was a nice way of putting it, really, before they actually told me the details. And they sat down here and told me the details. I was just numb. I couldn't believe it.
I asked Leonore about meeting Tony Eriksen for the first time.
He came up and kissed me on the mouth, which was a real shock. And I thought, wow, that's not the way to behave. That's weird. And I just wondered, well, the way he reacted with me, does he do it to other women as well? You know, and, I know he's had relationships with older women. He made a thing of it. He was proud of it, that older women liked him.
So, when he kissed you on the mouth, was it like it just seemed inappropriate, I guess, to you?
Well, it was pretty fierce. You know, it wasn't just a peck. It was like you'd be kissing someone who you knew very well.
As potentially
in an intimate relationship, shall I say. It was shocking. It was shocking to me.
So was Lisa there at this stage, at the party?
Oh, she would have been there, yeah. But she wouldn't have been viewing it. And she may not have noticed it, you know, grab you, kiss you. Who knows what goes on.
Before this, Lisa had been living in Hong Kong with her then-husband, Ian Thomson. But their marriage broke down and she moved back to Sydney, where she started seeing Eriksen. When did you discover that they were an item? Did Lisa ring you or tell you?
Not too long after that.
And what was your reaction?
Well, I was happy that she'd found someone that she was quite happy with. Very happy indeed. Happier than she'd ever been.
The couple had many social gatherings at their apartment, which was bigger than most of the others in the complex.
Well, they used to entertain a lot at home, and we'd see them every Christmas. They'd always have the penthouse in the apartment building, and we'd have... Lisa used to go to a lot of trouble. She was a great entertainer. And she'd do something funny, you know, like one year we had all these funny glasses, all different, sitting around the table. It was great fun.
That does sound good.
That's mainly where we met at Christmas parties and maybe birthday parties. Not a lot, but can't remember where else we met. Oh, we went to an art exhibition at the art gallery once. I forget what it was. And we just went around together looking at the pictures. And he wouldn't venture a comment until I made a comment. He wouldn't comment on anything to make sure he agreed with me.
Really?
Well, it was a bit obvious that he did, yes.
He tried hard then?
That's not a sin.
No, but he tried hard.
Yes, he was trying to impress. And I thought, well, that's all right.
Leonore, like everyone else, learned most of the details that led to her daughter's murder in court.
In December 2022, Ms Fenwick was made redundant from her role at an insurance firm. This placed additional financial stress on the relationship. By at least this time, and most likely for some considerable time before, Ms Fenwick wanted to end the relationship with the offender. She wanted him to move out of the unit they shared.
Several months before, Eriksen made inquiries of alternate living arrangements.
On 11 February 2023, the offender called Men's Line Australia and Link to Home seeking emergency accommodation. The calls were recorded. In each call, the offender had recounted issues in the relationship with Ms Fenwick. These included that he was unemployed and had little to no financial means. He indicated that Ms Fenwick wanted him to move out,
but made no attempts to secure them. Lisa evidently knew what Eriksen was capable of.
Ms Fenwick had been discussing problems in her and the offender's relationship with her family and friends. She told her friend Michelle Roberts in text messages that she was fearful of the offender. She said, "I, sick if anything happens to me before, but believe I am of sound mind. I hate living in fear." Ms Fenwick had also been attending counselling from March 2023. The notes made by the counsellor after the first session on 8 March 2023 record that Ms Fenwick was finding her situation increasingly difficult and was beginning to resent the offender as he was financially dependent on her. The notes record she said that, as the offender was unemployed, he was reliant on her for all financial matters, including rent, food, clothing, bills and incidentals. Ms Fenwick told the counsellor that the financial pressure was getting to her, particularly since she was made redundant. The counsellor's notes recorded that Ms Fenwick said she could not move forward with her life whilst he was weighing her down, but she could not figure out how to remove the offender from her life without feeling guilty. Ms Fenwick told Ms Roberts by text messages about some of these counselling sessions. She also told another friend, Robert Sajarian, about that counselling in text messages. In text messages to each of them on the 8th of March 2023, she asked them to keep in touch as she did not feel safe with the offender.
In the end, she realised she'd have to be the one to leave.
The notes made by the counsellor after the third session on the 4th of April 2023 record that Ms Fenwick told the counsellor that the relationship between her and the offender had irretrievably broken down and that she finally realised she had to leave. The notes recorded that Ms Fenwick told the counsellor that she was contacting local real estate agents to search for an apartment in the area, with her long-term goals being to leave the offender, find a new place to live and get a fulfilling job.
And as we've seen over and over again, the leaving was when she lost her life.
Well, I don't think there were any signs. This really came out of the blue, this horrific incident.
Yeah, but she did reach out and send these messages saying that if anything happens to me, so that's a bit of an alarm bell, right? So why then did no one act?
I'm not sure. I guess a lot of people don't ever see this coming. I think that's why we're sort of still in this world where, you know, we know these things happen, but when it's someone that you know, I just don't think anybody saw this coming. I don't think I think that's the tragedy of it.
Like many others, Lisa was relatively isolated. I don't think anyone would have thought he was capable of killing her, did they?
No, it never entered our heads. I knew it was going to end, but not like this.
It was left to Lisa's family to clean out the unit, including Eriksen's belongings.
Oh, we just put it all in one corner in the flat and we let whoever wanted, you know, he had no friends or anything. There was only the car, and some relative of his came and took it and just whizzed in, took it and went, you know, never even saw him or spoke to him.
Lisa's ex-husband, Ian Thomson, who attended the sentence hearing, said he spoke to her shortly before she was killed.
She'd explained to me that because of the change of employment circumstances which had happened, she could no longer continue to support the accommodation and him, because she was paying financially supporting him. And the intention was to move it on, but she gave me the impression that she was happy for him to stay there at that stage, but he was meant to move out, and it was going to come to an end, a point where she had to call quits. And what I'm scared of is that was the point they'd reached, that she had to give notice on the property, she needed to start to move on with her next thing, and he refused to move.
Careful to respect Lisa's boundaries, they remained amicable.
We had a long relationship, but mutually decided to separate when we were living in Hong Kong. She found that she wanted to come back due to certain circumstances, and so we did that, and I stayed on in Hong Kong and came back a few years ago. So my relationship was that. The great tragedy of this case was that we correspond a little bit. I was very careful with the correspondence in coming back, that she knew I was coming back and things, so that we wouldn't accidentally bump into each other. But We had planned to catch up, but it just hadn't been convenient. So this was just so devastating that, we were hoping just to catch up. I was hoping to meet her dogs, just the context, because we had many schnauzers throughout the relationship and things. And so all that was part of it. It was just the shock of this was so numbing.
Just stopping here, many of you, like I did, will want to know what happened to the schnauzers. You'll be happy to learn they found a good home straight away. Back to Ian Thomson outside court after the sentence hearing.
She'd been potentially dangerous, did you? Or?
No, so the circumstances was I'd been told that she'd partnered with somebody at some stage there, but I felt that's her life and good on her, if you know what I mean, to have a positive relationship and move forward.
Ian had sat with Lisa's family and closest friends. One of those was Michelle, the recipient of Lisa's ominous text messages just before her death.
If anything happens to me, believe I am of sound mind. I'm fearful of Tony. That is why I'm telling you this.
Michelle didn't want to be interviewed, but for Ian, it was the first time he'd learned the truth of Lisa's situation in the lead-up to her murder.
So you found out what happened today in all that detail?
Yeah.
How did you find, what was your reaction to it?
The debate about whether it was premeditated. I mean, he knew what he was doing when he did it. He went and got a knife. He took it there. I mean, it wasn't like he'd just been standing in the kitchen and accidentally and picked it up and in a moment of anger had done something. He went, got the knife. He took it there. He then repeatedly attacked her. I mean, that is it's deeply wounding and very hard. It's just very hard to take. Yeah.
Did you know how bad it was? Did you realise?
Not before today. No, I hadn't. I knew that there'd been a stabbing. I knew it had been not once but multiple times, but 25 times and things. It's just extraordinary, and the depth and the whole. I mean, it wasn't an accidental event. I mean, he's attacked her viciously with an intent of bringing end of her life. No question, and in a horrific manner. I mean, she's tried to defend herself to some degree, to the degree she could. Just appalling.
And what about him, when you saw him? Was that the first time you'd seen him?
I knew Tony from a long time back because we knew he'd actually attended our wedding, and so because of his partner at that time had been a close friend of Lisa's. But I hadn't realised who it was until I got the newspaper article when the incident happened, and that his picture came up, and that was a revelation. But how he's looking now is completely different, and I don't get it. I really just what he's doing, where he's at mentally is just so appalling, and just a total. He's sacked 4 lawyers in this process. He sits there and says, "I won't make any comment." Doesn't want to interact with the court. I mean, it's not insane. It's just denial of the circumstances and the effects of what he's done. There's no evidence of remorse. It's just it's like it's inconvenient for him. It's like, this is not what I want. This is not fair on him. Because he's it's impacted on him. That seems to be, the big thing.
Ian said in his mind, Eriksen's actions were premeditated.
It's an act that was probably premeditated on different occasions and probably on that day had been pre-thought of by him. He then weaponised and went and did it. And when the exact circumstances are obviously uncertain, but as far as I can see, he knew what he was wanting to do, knew what he was doing, and he went and did it. And there's no justification. If he comes out again, he'll still be a danger in society, because if the circumstances arise, it would seem that he will do it again. I just think as long as possible, and there's no mediation, there's no excuse not to do that.
No rehabilitation.
No, he's a danger to society. How can you rehabilitate a guy who's in denial, that not engaging with the court process? He's refused proper legal advice repeatedly.
If we apply the homicide timeline, the situation was at least at stage 6.
Now, when we get to stages 6 and 7, we start to predict homicide. And that's when things get really, really dangerous. So stage 6 we call homicidal ideation. So this is when the person realises that the situation's irreversible or irretrievable. This person's never coming back to them, or they don't even want them back now because they're so aggrieved.
Eriksen was used to getting what he wanted and had done so for a long time. He preyed on Lisa's good nature and took advantage of her drive and determination to succeed.
She was always a very serious child. She never laughed a lot, but she did have a very, very good sense of humour at times. And she was very kind and very sensitive to other people. If they're she would notice if people were in trouble or worried about something. Very kind and generous, extremely generous.
So consider it compassionate, kind of...
Passionate?
Compassionate.
Oh, compassion. Oh, yes. Very much so.
Yeah. So she seemed to me, and I'm only just looking at her life, but she had very high expectations of herself, or she strove a lot.
Yes, she was very ambitious, yes. And a perfectionist. She wanted to do everything perfectly, and she would take time to get everything right in her work, or anything, I guess, really.
What was her job?
Well, she started off, she did an arts degree, and she majored in German, and she started off as a typist, or shorthand typist in a German firm in North Sydney.
Different.
And she gradually got into graphic design, and she was very good at it, being a perfectionist. And what did she do after that? She got into insurance. She must have trained to be a bid manager in the insurance industry, and she ended up doing a very high-level job there.
In sentencing, Justice Coleman said the case was an anomaly.
The offender has expressed no remorse for the offence. He has not shown any insight into the impact that the death of Miss Fenwick has had and will have on her friends and family. There is nothing on which the court could make a sensible assessment of the prospects of rehabilitation, although now at 64 years of age, and having regard to the lengthy period of time he must inevitably spend in custody, his age on release to parole will mean that it is relatively unlikely that he may commit offences of this nature again. The court is in the unusual position of knowing nothing about any relevant aspects of the offender's history or subjective case which may impact upon the sentence. But that is a matter of his choice. It is unknown why he chose to terminate the services of his lawyers on the sentence proceedings, refused to engage in the psychological assessment arranged by them, or in the preparation of the sentence assessment report. The court must therefore sentence the offender absent consideration of matters which may otherwise have been raised in his subjective case. The best that could be said for the offender is that he had admitted that he stabbed Miss Fenwick, although that admission was in the face of an overwhelming case, including the 000 call when he had said he had put a knife in her. He limited the issues at trial to whether the Crown could prove that his act in stabbing Miss Fenwick was willful and voluntary. He did not waste time by asking irrelevant questions of any witness. This did reduce the time the trial took and the distress to the family of Miss Fenwick. There is nothing which reduces the moral culpability of the offender for the heinous and brutal murder of his partner.
You'll recall what forensic psychiatrist Dr. Russ Scott said about narcissistic personality disorder.
There are two subtypes of NPD. There's the grandiose type and the vulnerable type. Those with vulnerable type of NPD report lower self-esteem and lower trust. Features of both types of NPD can occur together. A recent qualitative study found that while both grandiose and vulnerable narcissists can be violent, the violence or narcissistic rage was triggered by different factors. Grandiose narcissists, like Baden Clay, become violent when triggered by threats to their self-esteem, while vulnerable narcissists experience explosive anger episodes triggered by fear of abandonment.
While not sentenced to life imprisonment, Eriksen will be 81 before he's eligible for parole.
Anthony Eriksen, for the murder of Lisa Fenwick, for which you were convicted by a jury on 24 June 2025, I sentence you to a non-parole period of 20 years with a balance of term of 6 years and 8 months. That is a total sentence of 26 years and 8 months. The sentence will be backdated to commence on 9 April 2023 and expire on 8 December 2049. The first date you will be eligible for release to parole is 8 April 2043.
Eriksen's actions weren't considered premeditated. DV New South Wales Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer Angie Gehle.
I think the main issues are the accessibility for victim survivors of domestic, family and sexual violence. From the very beginning, we all have an expectation that particularly the criminal justice system, holds people to account, is a safe platform for, reporting and for disclosing, really horrendous acts of violence against a person. But the reality is that that expectation is quite often not met by the victim survivor and or their supports. And so then there's this big gap between what is the system and what the system should be.
Absolutely. What this latest series is all about, the intimate partner homicides. So yeah. I'd imagine the same applies for the victims' families.
I mean, that person, has been taken in the most heinous way. And if it's a trial, you've got a jury trying to figure out, in what circumstances did this happen, and at what level of responsibility should the perpetrator be held at, and what level of accountability they need to be held at. And you have a complete void there, which is the victim survivor. The victim survivor has absolutely no right of reply to anything that's being put to the court. And I think for family members in that space, it is crushing. Knowing that they have to be silent in that space. It's a very, very clinical setting. It's a very, again, a very adversarial setting. There's punitive outcomes ultimately if you try and speak up on behalf of that victim So there is absolutely really no right of reply, except potentially in a victim impact statement if the person is convicted. And that again is at the end of proceedings.
I then referred to an apology offered by Tyrone Thompson, who you'll recall in the last episode. She questioned Thompson's sincerity in apologising right before the sentencing.
Quite late in the piece, what you'll find is that the defendant will be instructed, or it will be suggested to the defendant that they write a letter to the family of apology or some kind of recompense. And for some families, that is the biggest kick in the guts that you can actually get, because domestic and family violence trials, sexual violence trials, some murder trials, you're looking at a 2-year hold. So you've got a victim survivor or the family of a victim survivor on hold effectively for 2 years before it hits the trial date. You've got all of that time effectively to have accepted responsibility and accountability and drafted that letter. You've got a lot of time sitting there waiting for a trial to come around, and at the very last minute, when it looks like your back's against the wall, that's when you write the letter.
Yeah, which is now. I want to, talk about, not, specifically, but Tyrone Thompson's a good example where, I don't know how much more violent it can get than someone stabbing someone 78 times. And obviously there was an intent to kill, which was acknowledged, but then apparently not being premeditated.
Yeah, it's a really tricky point, I think, in New South Wales and I mean within the legal system. In terms of sentencing, they will look at precedents. So they'll look at other matters of similar veracity, I suppose, that they look at similar matters effectively, and they will make decisions based on the precedents that has been set by those matters. And we're in 2026 now, and those matters were horrendous then, but I think the level of understanding of domestic and family violence wasn't potentially where it needed to be when those decisions were being made. And I think we need to actually really come into the here and now and use the current knowledge and the currency that we have to look at domestic family violence, homicides in a way that they are the worst of the worst. This, like when you're looking at the behaviour of Tyrone Thompson, he went to her house, he went to Mackenzie's house, I have no doubt, to cause her fear. He was already making those plans prior to being released from custody is what the reports say.
You'll recall last episode, Thompson even told someone he was going to kill Mackenzie. But while intent was accepted, premeditation wasn't, because Mackenzie had the knife first.
The fact that she was so terrified that the last resort for her was to arm herself with a knife.
And similarly with Tony Eriksen as well, right? Because, he went and got the knife. And again, it's a very violent stabbing, there's no confusing that with wanting to kill.
Yeah, and if you track sort of some of the behaviours, particularly of Anthony Eriksen in terms of, the real coercive nature of his behaviour, it was almost like a bit of a game for him in kind of reading through some of the reports in terms of his background and his behaviours, and also his behaviours in the court. He held the power in that space. Even though he might have got a harsher sentence, he still controlled every single thing that went on in that courtroom. So you could kind of track that behaviour as being incredibly, incredibly coercive.
Do you think that the acknowledgement and the introduction of legislation to coercive control has really made a difference in understanding these crimes?
Yeah, look, I think it's a contentious one, the coercive control legislation in New South Wales. But what I see is that there is a lot more attention now on coercive control, what that looks like, what that feels like for victim survivors, and the impossibility around stepping outside of that for a victim survivor. I think, we've been in that horrible narrative for so long around, why don't women leave? And so I think we are seeing a bit of a shift.
With both Tony Eriksen and Tyrone Thompson, they had the violence considered mid-range in both those cases. I don't understand that. Do you understand that? Because I'm just trying to get my head around, well, what does what does high range look like?
And this is part of the issue when you're working with humans and the law. They're not symbiotic ultimately. So I think, in these scenarios, again, they are comparative. So the nature of the violence was comparative to a number of other matters. And based on the comparisons and the sentencing that those other matters received, it's in line with that. As a human being and as, as a woman, and as somebody who really cares about social justice and dignity, we would never deem that would be mid-range. And additionally to that, we really have to look at the aggravation of children being present. That's quite often not considered under the legislation unless the child is physically in the room, and you've got evidence to say the child was physically in the room and visibly saw the homicide. Now, a child could be anywhere in that home, and the impact of that level of violence on a child is going to be profound for the rest of that child's life, regardless if they're sitting next to mum or if they're in the room or if they're in the backyard. They've lost their mother, and quite often, if it is an intimate partner violence and it's the father or the person that's raised the child, they've lost both parents. But in our system in New South Wales, it's a really fine line about whether or not a child being present is an aggravating factor in terms of the offending. As a human being, as a mother, I would say it's a no-brainer, but the legal system, the law actually says otherwise.
This is a critical point, and one that Mackenzie's mum, Tabitha Ackred, is also fighting for, which you'll recall from last episode off the back of her daughter's murder being committed in front of her grandson.
It's about the child being validated. It's about me being validated, the family being validated.
Yeah, I think, we're constantly advocating for reforms to our Crimes, Domestic and Personal Violence Act, because it's outdated, and a lot of our legislation, including our sentencing legislation, it's quite, in my view, it's quite outdated in light of the complexities of the communities that we live in and ultimately the crimes that are being presented to the court. It's a lot more complex than it's ever been. But I think our end point in terms of sentencing in the judicial space is still, whilst it's legally complex, it's a bit humanely simplistic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, this is broke, isn't it?
Oh, it's so broken. It is. It is. And we've got advocates, saying how broken it is. And I think that we need some commitment in truly meaningfully examining what that actually means. Because there's still a big distinction, there's still that big gap between the judiciary and that legal space and kind of the rest of the community. So the lived experiences and that raw human experience is very far away from the judicial space. And I think we actually need to marry those up because the legal system is not a system in and of its own. It actually works with people.
Our discussion is reflective of the frustration of victims and families of victims, but is based on observation,
not legal expertise. So it was essential to find someone who could provide context and explain the application of the law.
So my name's Jane Wangmann. I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at UTS. I have a PhD that explored some particular issues around domestic violence in the legal process.
Dr Wangmann is also a member of New South Wales Coroner's Court Domestic Violence Death Review Team.
When I finished law school, which was back in the early 90s, the Law Reform Commission, the Australian Law Reform Commission, had an inquiry on women's equality, and I was very interested in those kinds of issues. And so I worked as a very junior legal researcher on that project, and we travelled around the country, and unsurprisingly, violence emerged as the major issue that anyone was talking to us about. And I look back at that and think that that must have really sparked my interest and commitment to working in the area.
You've been in this space for such a long time. What are the key things, do you think, that you have, or key takeaways of your career that you have learned during that time?
So it's interesting because at the moment because there were those dramatic and very upsetting homicides in Lake Gehle in New South Wales last week, and every time there is a homicide, we start to have questions about where we're going and what needs to be done and all of those kinds of things.
Referring to the recent triple killing you saw at the start of this episode.
Good afternoon. A manhunt is underway for a gunman who allegedly shot 3 people dead and seriously injured a 4th. Police are looking for Julian Ingram, also known as Pierpoint. He was last seen in this white Ford Ranger with council signage after allegedly opening fire around 4:30 yesterday afternoon. Police say he shot his heavily pregnant ex-partner Sophie Quinn and her new boyfriend John Harris while sitting in their car on Bocara Street. The 25 and 32-year-olds didn't make it to hospital.
And for me, having worked in this area for 30 years, I experience a great deal of frustration in the extent to which every homicide we kind of approach as though we didn't know anything about it, that it's kind of a surprise and why didn't we do more? I'm kind of shocked at the extent to which what we know from people with lived experience, what we know from the many advocates that work with them and through research, that it hasn't really translated into practices more than I would have hoped. At the same time, having been around for a long time, I also know how dramatically the system has changed for domestic violence victims, and so I can also celebrate and acknowledge that. So for example, when I was a solicitor back working in that community legal centre that's probably the mid to late 90s, most protection orders were private ones then. The police didn't apply for many of them. Now, well over 95% of protection orders are sought by the police on behalf of victims. So we've seen this really dramatic shift and change in the support that's provided to victims. So I think we need to not lose sight of that, even as we express frustration about how much more needs to change.
Yeah, well, I'm just looking here at your profile, and it talks about you draw on socio-legal research methods and feminist legal theory to investigate the intersection of law and domestic violence and improved access to justice. Can you explain what that, what that is in practice?
Sure. It doesn't sound very easy to understand. What I'm really interested in is how people experience the law. And so whilst I do read cases and legislation, obviously, most of my research involves interviews with victim survivors, with lawyers, with judges and magistrates about how they actually experience the law, like what it does for them. Because what's written on the books is often very different to how people experience the law, so particularly victim survivors. And so I do a lot of interviews, observations, looking at documents to sort of get that gap that we see between what's written down and what people experience. So, for example, women still complain about the way in which police don't take their matters seriously, or that they didn't get the order that they wanted, despite it looking as though it fits those conditions and legal requirements. And so I'm primarily interested in how people experience law, because that's where it actually lives.
So one of the things that In my travels and I guess research into this area seems to be the gap between the expectation from victims and the community and what the actual outcomes end up being, you know, with Tyrone Thompson and Anthony Eriksen ones that we're looking at in New South Wales, where they both it was a stabbing frenzy for both cases, right? And there seemed to be no doubt on the intent to kill because we're talking 78 times and 28 times, you know, yet, and in Thompson's case, there was even him telling someone that he was going to kill her, yet they're not considered premeditated.
I think there are a few things going on that are kind of difficult to explain. So one is there is a lot of community concern about what they see as lenient sentences around domestic violence homicides. And indeed, many of the domestic violence homicides, like the two that you've mentioned, by the perpetrator of violence in the relationship, do involve overkill. I mean, that's what we talk about it as. But there's also a real misunderstanding about what the process of sentencing involves. I don't think the public generally understands what it is that judges are doing when they sentence someone for any offence, but particularly for murder, which is our most serious of offences. And so how do judges take account of the individual circumstances of a case in coming up with a sentence in the end? And it's hard for these things to sit together.
She went on to explain the way judges determine a sentence.
Looking at a whole lot of things in sentencing in order to come up with a sentence. And so when you read a decision like Thompson's, you can see the judge talking about the objective seriousness of the offence, the purposes of sentencing, what the maximum penalty is and what the standard non-parole period is, and then talking about aggravating and mitigating circumstances. All of these matters go into coming up with a sentence. So it's both objective and subjective, and it's very much about the circumstances of the case and the offender. They do also look at comparable cases, but as you can see in many decisions, sometimes it is difficult to compare homicides, that there can be things that are quite unique about it, and they need to try to resolve some of those in coming up with a sentence. And so there is a lot of discussion, particularly through the work of the Domestic Violence Death Review team, of which I'm a member, about talking to judges about the language that they use in their decisions, in their sentencing decisions, to really denounce domestic violence, to give dignity to the victim and the community, and to denounce, to try to deter others. I think in recent years we're seeing some significant changes, but you can still find poor examples in sentencing where it looks as though the victim's being blamed. So the words that they use around mid-range and worst category, all of these are fundamentally offensive to family and friends. But they've got a legal meaning, but I think the High Court's made it clear that we should avoid this notion of worst category, because what is the worst category when you talk about murder?
So in both Thompson and Eriksen's murder, them being the perpetrator, it was gauged as mid-range level violence. What does that mean? Because, I mean, I can't think of much worse than Thompson's case.
So I might step back a bit first and just talk about what we know about average sentences and I'm just talking about murder. I'm not going to talk about other forms of homicide. So the Sentencing Council of New South Wales did an inquiry into homicide, which they published in 2021. The data that they provided, which was for a 3-year period from the 1st of April 2015 to the 31st of March 2018, there were 85 adult offenders who had been charged with murder. Only five of those people got life. So life really is a kind of last resort, and there's no parole for a life sentence. You are indeed in prison for your life. Of those 5 people, there are a couple that are domestic violence matters, so including matters against an intimate partner, but other family members like children, young people. So for the 80 people that didn't get a life sentence, the head sentence, so before you think about the non-parole period, the mean head sentence was 25.6 years and the mean non-parole period was 18.9 years. So then talking about this notion of mid-range, which I completely understand that is not, is one of those offensive terms that family and friends might encounter. It is also something that's really hard to understand when you have a case like Thompson's. I think it's worth noting that the judge in Thompson actually says, I'm not going to give you the point on the spectrum. And what you see in the sentencing decision is, in fact, the Crown saying, we think it's above mid-range, and the defence saying, well, actually, we think it's mid-range. The reason why they're using this language is because it's built into the legislation. So all I'm trying to say, I guess, is that the use of this mid-range language is, in fact, what the legal professionals are asked to do because the legislation tells them to do it. And mid-range is where the standard non-parole period will apply. One of the things that's significant after the Thompson case, and is due to Mackenzie's mother's advocacy around this, is changing the standard non-parole period for domestic violence homicides. The standard non-parole period will be 25 years. And so we should again start to see a shift in the sentences for domestic violence homicides.
We then move on to aggravating and mitigating circumstances, which also inform judges on the appropriate sentence.
I won't go through the whole list because there's quite a lot of them. So one is that it involved actual or threatened use of violence, that it involved the actual or threatened use of a weapon. But the fact that the aggravating factor is listed as a record of previous convictions is obviously one of the things that's people have talked about, is maybe that needs some reform when you're talking about domestic violence, given that most people don't report things to the police. Other aggravating factors, and one that was present in Thompson, was that it was committed in the presence of a child, and that was deemed an aggravating factor in this case. Committed in the home of the victim is an aggravating factor. If the offence involved gratuitous cruelty, the injury, emotional harm, loss or damage caused by the offence was substantial. These are all aggravating factors. That the offence was committed while the offender was on conditional liberty. And so that's where, for example, the homicides in Lake Gehle, he was on bail at the time, so that would be an aggravating factor. In the Thompson case, he was on parole for past offences. So mitigating circumstances are that the injury, emotional harm, loss or damage caused by the offence was not substantial. So you've got it was substantial as an aggravating factor and not substantial as a mitigating factor. Obviously, that's probably more relevant to non-homicide offences. That the offence was not planned is one of the mitigating factors. And at the moment, the legislation also says that the offender was provoked by the victim as a mitigating circumstance. Now, there's lots of discussion about that language in particular, probably because the law around provocation, we have often seen men's violence against women excused because they wanted to leave, they wanted to have a new relationship with someone. And so those kinds of very stereotypical gendered ideas about men and what provokes them is a place there. So I think it is unfortunate that the sentencing legislation still uses that language. I think there's other ways to talk about the context of the offence than to talk about it being provoked by the victim, which I think opens up the possibility of some victim blaming narratives. The law around provocation has changed a lot. So yes, you can't successfully argue provocation on that basis anymore. But you've got this clause here as a mitigation of And it would be interesting to actually look at what they are talking about in mitigation of sentence when they're talking about being provoked by the victim. Mm-hmm. In sentencing, they do look at the context of the offence and the offending in particular. The extent to which like a good picture of the domestic violence in the relationship is able to be presented to the court, it depends on a number of factors that are beyond just the sentencing restrictions. So there's rules around evidence. When there's a guilty plea, there's negotiations that have happened around agreed facts that might mean that there are some limitations on whether or not that full picture is able to be taken into account. The judge then also has to be aware, and so you do see sentencing decisions where they talk about coercive control, previous uncharged acts and all of those kinds of things of which they need to have had sufficient evidence, but they're not sentencing for those matters. What they're trying to do is to place the offending in context in order that, particularly for those offenders who have no criminal record, have no, all their character references are, exemplary and all that kind of stuff. If there wasn't some space for some sort of contextual evidence of uncharged acts and behaviour, then that act would appear out of the blue and simply inexplicable to a jury, for example. And so that evidence is particularly important in those cases where you don't have some of the things that you have, for example, in Thompson's case of prior convictions and records and so on. So the other mitigating circumstance which links to an aggravating circumstance is that the offender doesn't have a record or doesn't have a significant record of previous convictions. Unlikely to reoffend is another mitigating circumstance.
Yeah.
The offender has good prospects of rehabilitation, and our rehabilitation is like one of those sentencing principles that's kind of hard, or sentencing factors that's kind of hard to understand. It's the purpose of sentencing to promote the rehabilitation of the offender. This was a factor in Thompson's case because of his relative youth, and also some other matters related to his mental health and so on. So that can also be a factor that sits in tension with talking about domestic family violence and talking about their offending. Whether the offender's shown remorse is also a mitigating factor. There's also discounts around whether or not they assisted the law enforcement investigation and so on.
Is there an example where someone has sort of been released and all of a sudden become a model citizen?
Yeah, I can't actually, and I think that's probably something to do with so the cases that we look at are closed cases, so that means that all the legal proceedings have finished, including their appeal time periods and so on.
You talked about the progress, being optimistic, but there's obviously still a way to go, and that latest triple homicide domestic violence one, I mean, while shocking, isn't shocking really, and it's just more of the same.
So the homicides last week, as they always do, give me pause to thought about why we are still here. There does seem to be remaining some knowledge translation gap. And so even though bail is an important mechanism and it is simply not possible for every domestic violence offender charged to be to be refused bail. It's impractical. But I think bail deciders also need to think about the way in which pregnancy, separation, stalking are all factors that increase the seriousness of the matter that should go to assessments of risk. And I guess I'm interested in the way in which it appears that we haven't been, despite talking about it for a long time, we haven't sort of moved it across to people really understanding it. And I'm puzzled by that lack of knowledge translation when if you talk to anyone in the sector, the people that practice the law, that bring it to life, it's their understanding that animates the law, right? And if they don't have an adequate understanding of domestic and family violence and risk, then they're going to animate the law in a particular way. a particular technical kind of way. So we still need to work on that.
Why does there seem to be such a reticence still?
Yeah, I can't answer why, given, I guess you're getting me in a bit of a frustrated space, because I have been around for a long time and I've been returning to many of the old reports on domestic violence. And even though the language and the understanding is very different in those old reports, there are things that are just echoed across time. And so I've been going back to Neville Rand's Domestic and Family Violence Report, which is 1981. I was very young then, but I have been returning to it. You have the same talk of this is urgent, this is a national crisis, we have to have federal and state governments together. And you have echoes of recommendations, education for police, judges, funding the domestic and family violence sector, doing important work around supports for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and training for the police around cultural issues. And so there is this frustration of why we have these recommendations and we are still not kind of getting that. So lots has changed, but it's this meaning thing.
Yeah, I think that seems to be the difference, because you talk about 81, I got out of school mid-90s when you were really coming into this space, and I was completely ignorant to all this stuff. Coercive control, particularly gaslighting's only become a term in the last, 5 years.
Yeah.
That is all brand spanking new to us. So the fact that we're talking about it and putting a spotlight on it, hopefully, fingers crossed, hey, Jane.
And I think, when I think about coercive control, so that's always been the definition I've used in my work. I might not have used the term, but it's certainly always been the sort of definition or understanding in my work, acknowledging that it wasn't necessarily legally actionable. What has been interesting and is, I guess, the good news story is giving victim survivors the language to describe their experiences is incredibly powerful. And that, again, so we're ending on a hopeful note. I think it's a really useful thing. So I remember it was before the law came into operation, and I did a community education session with workers up here on the Central Coast, and one of the workers said, we had a woman come in and she'd gone to the police saying, I'm experiencing coercive control. And it's just like, isn't that an amazing story of giving language to someone to describe their experiences?
Next week, how a killer who mowed down his partner in a car served less than 3 years in prison.
Police had been through the property, and when we were allowed to go in and collect, I think we were finding knives, all the guns, camo, hunting gear, and we're like, did the police not seize any of this stuff?
And the difficulties dealing with expert abusers.
We know that the types of behaviors that those perpetrators use are usually well practiced. They're the same behaviors during the homicide that have been used over the years with that victim while they're alive.
If you would like to share any information on the cases we've mentioned or discuss a different intimate partner homicide, please contact us. Just email us at kissandkill@7.com.au or visit our website 7news.com.au/kissandkill. Check out our show notes for information about everyone you've heard in today's episode, but also links to various domestic and family violence charities which are making enormous headway in this space. If you're on Facebook or Instagram, you can follow us to see photos and updates relevant to the series. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to subscribe. Please rate and review our series. It helps new listeners find us. Presenter and executive producer, Alison Sandy. Sound design, Mark Wright. Assistant producer and video editor, Cassie Woodward. Graphic design and animation, Jason Blanford. Special thanks to Dr. Claire Ferguson and Sherelle Moody. This is a 7 News production.